My name's Lena Grant, senior backend developer, 6 years in, 3 live platforms, 1 crash record, 0 outages since 2019. I didn't need to say any of that in the meeting. The numbers had already been printed on the 3rd page of the review packet. But my boss never flipped that far. He opened with, "We've been thinking about resource allocation. This next phase, maybe we don't need senior eyes on every sprint." The words were neutral. The intent wasn't. I let him talk. He walked around the idea for 5 minutes, used words like streamlining, rebalancing, lean support, then finally landed where I already knew he was going. "We're adjusting compensation to reflect new responsibilities, but you'll still be involved at a high level." That was the pitch. In translation, you'll still carry the title, but not the authority, and definitely not the pay. I didn't argue. I asked one thing. "Can you send me the revised role description? I want to be clear on what I'll be expected to do moving forward." He smiled as if I'd agreed. I hadn't. I was documenting. The email came that afternoon. Bullet points, clean phrases, code review support upon request, shadow guidance for junior staff, no direct deployment responsibility, no mention of ownership, no sign of decision rights, no requirement to support live demos. I saved the email. That same week, 3 new interns were onboarded. One of them, Jacob, was assigned to a feature I'd architected 2 quarters ago. He had good energy, asked questions, worked fast, too fast. By Friday, he submitted a pull request that rewrote a module I'd patched quietly last year. Not because anyone asked, just because he thought the logic could be cleaner. I didn't override it, didn't approve it either. I wasn't listed as reviewer. 2 days later, the code went live on staging. Nothing broke. That was the problem. Because when things don't break, people stop asking who kept them together. On Monday, I got pulled into a short sync with my boss again. He was upbeat. "Jacob's making real progress. Honestly, I think we've underestimated how effective intern devs can be when you give them room." I nodded. "Sure, interns can code too." That line stuck with him. I meant it as a reminder. He heard it as validation. From that point on, I wasn't asked to check anything. Just looped in for continuity. I stopped getting build notices. My dashboard access was downgraded. But every time something moved forward, my name was still in the credits, as if the structure was holding, just with new paint. I knew better, because there were pieces I'd kept together that never made it into documents. Edge cases, live fixes, hot patches deployed during 3 a.m. alerts that no one tracked, because they never failed again. And now those pieces were being touched, rewritten, streamlined. I didn't stop them. I did one thing. I printed out the scope email, the one with my new responsibilities, folded it once, slid it into my notebook, and waited. Not out of spite, not to prove anything, just to see how long the system could walk without knowing where its knees had been braced. The funny thing about taking something apart is that if it doesn't fall apart immediately, people think it never mattered. The interns were fast, eager, efficient in a way that makes managers feel clever for spotting potential. They worked late, asked each other for help, built a Slack thread titled Refactor Squad. They didn't ask me for much. And that was the point. According to the new role scope, I wasn't responsible for pushing code, only supporting continuity where requested, but no one was requesting anything. So I followed the language literally. I stopped opening pull requests unless tagged. I didn't run cross-env tests. I didn't sit in design huddles or deployment calls. I became exactly what I'd been redefined into. A presence, not a participant. Jacob, now their de facto lead, was in charge of the dashboard feature I'd quietly kept alive for the last 18 months. He rewrote parts of it in a single weekend. "Flattened the logic," he said. "Cut the load time by a second." He wasn't wrong, but he didn't realize what he'd flattened was a patch I'd implemented during a critical outage last year, one that protected the app from a specific input sequence a client used in demo mode. That sequence had never been documented. It wasn't in the user flow. It was something the client's sales team had insisted on using to show real-time data toggling. I remembered it because I was the one who had taken the 2 a.m. call when the demo failed, before we fixed it without ever writing it down. Now that fix was gone, replaced with cleaner code. No one noticed. Not yet. The staging environment still ran smooth because of cached data. The old script's result had already been stored there. But the next build, clean and fresh, would rebuild without that silent patch. They didn't know that. I didn't warn them. Not because I wanted the system to break, but because my scope no longer included protecting it. One afternoon, while walking past the war room, I heard Jacob presenting the updated demo build to the boss. He said something about streamlined architecture, and the phrase intern-led optimization made it into the conversation. My name wasn't mentioned. I kept walking. That evening, the client confirmed their upcoming in-person demo. First one in 2 years. High visibility, live showcase. The prep email went out company-wide. I was CC'd not as a participant, but as a technical continuity observer. The line sat like a bruise on the screen. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't ask to be removed. I saved the email, highlighted the phrase, and added it to the folder I'd started keeping since the pay cut. Not for revenge, just for record. Because when people forget why something held, they need a trace, not a warning, not a voice, just a mirror to see what they erased. The build passed? Of course it did. They pushed to staging on a Tuesday afternoon. Jacob ran a short demo over Zoom, toggled through screens, clicked all the right buttons. Nothing blinked, nothing crashed. The dashboard lit up. The numbers rolled clean. Applause came from 2 managers. The boss nodded like a man who'd just proven something personal. See, all this worry, and it works better now. I didn't say anything. Not because I was holding back, because that sentence had become its own kind of warning. They weren't checking for what might happen. They were celebrating what hadn't happened yet. Staging environments have memory, not logic, memory. If a feature has been run before, especially in the same sequence, the system doesn't rebuild it from zero. It loads fragments, reuses what worked, glides on cached success. Especially when no one resets the backend properly. That's what they didn't know. That what they were seeing wasn't proof of correctness. It was residue from the last time it worked. The bug that crashed the app last year, it never showed up in regular flow. Only when a client triggered a toggle flip from one unfiltered view to another while pulling comparative time ranges. It was an edge case built on habits, not code, and it had been patched, by me, with a runtime redirect that restructured the input silently, then passed it downstream without logging. Now, that patch was gone, and no one was testing the same trigger path, because no one remembered how that bug got caught in the first place. The boss posted an internal announcement the next day. New client demo version deployed, thanks to the refactor squad for the lightning turnaround. Faster, simpler, smarter. I didn't reply. I clicked the link, ran the app myself. Everything loaded. The graphs shimmered. Tables responded. Even the theme felt faster. But I knew the difference between working and surviving. And this build wasn't built to survive. On Thursday, the staging link was packaged and shared with the client team for preview. Their lead confirmed demo readiness. Date locked, on site. I got the calendar invite that evening. My name wasn't in the title, not in the notes, just in the list, buried below a line marked, Technical Observer, Internal Only. I highlighted it, then scrolled to the approval chain. Final sign-off, the boss. No one had asked me to test the final path. No one had asked what the old patch was doing there in the first place. No one had asked if this cleaner version had been walked through a real trigger flow. So I didn't answer. Instead, I updated my folder. 2 files added, demo approval, invite confirmation. The app hadn't crashed, but that wasn't a sign of success. It was the sound of everyone forgetting that silence doesn't mean stability. It just means nothing's tripped yet. The final demo build was approved in under 7 minutes. Not because it was flawless, because no one was looking for anything that might say otherwise. Jacob sent the package with a short note. All tests green on staging. He attached a checklist, auto-generated, all boxes ticked. The boss skimmed it, clicked reply, added a smiley, and forwarded it to client services with the line, locked and loaded, can't wait to show this off. No review, no walkthrough, no second environment test. They had staging. Staging didn't crash. That was enough, except it wasn't. What no one noticed was that the client hadn't changed how they used the product. Same sequence, same toggle path, same exact keystrokes from 2 years ago. They had a script, verbatim, and demoed it the same way every time. I knew, because I'd watched them do it 4 times, and I remembered how it used to fail. I remembered staying up one night trying to trace the issue through logs that led nowhere, only to realize it wasn't a bug in logic. It was a sequence mismatch between data state and UI memory. The fix wasn't elegant, but it worked. I deployed it without announcement, no documentation, no note in version history, just a single-line redirect, hard-coded behind a conditional flag. When the interns rewrote that module, they cleared the patch without realizing it existed. I didn't restore it. The email announcing final sign-off included a list of attendees for the upcoming client demo. It was labeled Priority Account Engagement. The sales team had prepped scripts. The boss was flying in. Jacob was selected to present the tech segment, his first major client-facing appearance. I wasn't on the active list, but I was copied under a subheading: Observer, Technical Support, no speaking role. It was the fourth time that phrase showed up in a document about this demo. Each time, it got smaller. I didn't request a change. I didn't raise a flag. I printed the itinerary. That week, Jacob ran a dry run for internal review. Everything went well. He rehearsed his transitions, got nods from the marketing lead, and closed with the line, "You'll see how fast this runs now." No one tested what happens when the client toggles before the dataset fully loads. No one asked if the fallback script still existed. And I didn't offer, not because I was waiting for failure, but because I'd been removed from prevention. The boss posted another update on Slack. Intern-led engineering hitting milestones, great energy across teams. He tagged Jacob. Tagged the intern team, left me out. That was fine. I wasn't the story anymore. I was the variable no one included in the equation, because the system hadn't crashed yet. What they didn't understand was simple. You don't feel the absence of structure and quiet. You feel it when everything starts moving at once and nothing holds. The room chosen for the demo was one of the newer ones. Glass walls, ceiling-mounted screens, minimalist everything. A tech-forward setup meant to impress, but every piece of it reflected what couldn't be controlled: the people using it. Lena arrived early, not because she was eager, but because she'd been listed as technical observer and knew better than to walk in mid-demo. She took her seat along the back wall, unacknowledged. No one needed her yet. The client sat across from Jacob and the boss, ready with their familiar opening line. "Let's run through our sales scenario." Jacob nodded, adjusted the display, and began his click-through. Each screen glided into the next. The charts loaded quickly. Toggles responded fast. The app on the surface looked flawless. Jacob smiled as he moved into the final sequence. To him, it was just another section. But Lena recognized it instantly. This was the loop she'd patched long ago, back when the client's custom toggling caused input confusion and temporary breakdown. She hadn't fixed it through the official repo. There had been no pull request. It was handled during a weekend patch, coded directly into staging as a silent redirect. That line was gone now. When Jacob triggered the comparative toggle and pulled a custom time range across multiple views, the screen hesitated. He clicked again. The table tried to load, then collapsed into an error message. The display dimmed as the system threw a timeout warning. Jacob froze. The client exchanged a glance. The boss leaned forward with the kind of confidence that only exists when you think a bug is still recoverable. "Could be a slow data fetch," he said casually before motioning to Jacob to reload. It didn't reload. The client sat back in silence. One of them checked the Wi-Fi, although Lena knew it wasn't the network, it was the logic. The very logic that had been invisible when it worked, and painfully obvious now that it had been rewritten without understanding what it once absorbed. After one final attempt, the client closed their laptop, stood, and said, "We'll give you time to stabilize the system. Let's reconvene when that's ready." They didn't wait for a reply. The room deflated behind them. Jacob stepped back from the screen. The boss said nothing. It wasn't necessary. The silence had already framed the cost of mistaking structure for redundancy. Lena remained seated. Jacob eventually approached. "Was that a back-end issue?" She opened her notebook, took out the printed copy of her revised role description, the same one HR had emailed after they cut her salary. She passed it to him without expression, letting the paper speak where she didn't need to. He skimmed the bullets, realized what it was, looked up at her. She met his eyes once and said simply, "That feature hasn't been part of my scope since your version replaced mine." She stood, collected her things, and left the room before he could ask anything else. The document was still in his hand. That line, just one redirect handler, had never been elegant. It had only existed to catch the one place where the system forgot how to fall gracefully. But like most things that keep a structure alive, no one saw it until it was gone. And now, its absence had made itself unforgettable. The crash wasn't reported immediately, not officially. The client didn't send a complaint. They didn't demand an explanation. They simply went quiet. That was louder. The day after the demo, the boss called an emergency huddle with product, dev, and client services. Not to assign blame, yet, but to rebuild confidence before things escalated. Jacob was already at the table when Lena walked in. She hadn't been invited, but someone had forwarded the calendar link, and no one had the nerve to ask why she showed up. The first 15 minutes were noise, metrics, code diffs, environment logs. Everyone spoke in hypotheticals, until Denise from legal entered the room. She wasn't on the original invite. She didn't sit, just stood in the corner, flipping through a printed client agreement. "I need to confirm," she said, looking directly at the boss. "Who approved the build for this demo?" His voice dropped slightly. "I did. Based on staging tests, it passed." "Was there a compliance checklist?" He hesitated. "Standard checklist." QA signed off. Denise nodded slowly, then turned to Jacob. "And you were the engineer leading this deployment?" Jacob looked down. "Yes, but it wasn't meant to be final. It was the same structure we'd been using." Denise held up a page. "This clause states that any material demonstration to enterprise clients must include a fallback protocol if critical views are changed. Was there a fallback?" He didn't answer. She turned to Lena. "You've worked on this feature before. Did it used to have one?" Lena didn't move. "Yes, it was implemented manually, never formalized." Denise nodded. "Was it part of the current deployment?" "No," Lena said. "That code was replaced." "Did you remove it?" "I was not part of the refactor." She could feel the air pull tighter, not because she was trying to trap anyone, but because the room was realizing, in real time, that there was no one left to answer the one question that mattered. What kept this working? After the meeting, the conversation turned defensive. Teams started checking old commits. Jacob went quiet. The boss began rewriting his emails, adding disclaimers, timestamps, trying to create a trail where none had been drawn. By evening, a message from the client arrived. It wasn't emotional, just a request for documentation. They wanted version history, change logs, and rollback protocols. The kind of email that doesn't accuse, but always leads somewhere legal. That night, Lena received a call from the finance lead. "Hey, just out of curiosity," he said, too casually. "Do you remember what fallback handler was in place for the dashboard redirect back in Q2 last year?" She opened a drawer, pulled out the folder she'd kept since her compensation had been reduced, and flipped to a printed line of code she'd saved on instinct alone. It wasn't formatted. It wasn't reusable. It just worked. "I remember," she said. "Could you forward it?" She paused. Number it was part of a role I no longer hold. There was a long silence on the other end. "I get it," he finally said. "No worries." She wasn't angry. She didn't gloat. She simply let the weight of the system rest where it had been rerouted, to every person who thought they could simplify what they didn't fully understand. That fallback handler wasn't just a patch. It had become a line they couldn't restore, because the person who wrote it was the first thing they removed when the numbers didn't add up. And now, with nothing left to catch them, they were learning that cleaner code doesn't mean safer structure, especially when the safety had been written in silence. When the email from the client's engineering lead came in, it didn't contain accusations, just 6 words. "Please clarify structural logic handling failsafes." It was more than enough, because in those 6 words, they confirmed what the internal team had only suspected. Someone outside the building had seen what was missing, and was now asking who had let it go. The boss didn't panic, not in front of the team. He pulled together an emergency strategy session with leadership, product, and legal. Lena wasn't included on the invite. But halfway through, Denise walked to her desk, held out a printed copy of the client's message, and said, "Come with me." She didn't ask, she didn't explain, and Lena didn't need context. They entered the glass conference room together. 4 people were already seated. The boss, Wes the CEO, someone from legal, and Jacob. A 5th chair was empty. It was for her. No one spoke when she sat. The document in question was on the screen. The app diagram. The dashboard module. The segment that had failed during the demo. Every arrow pointed to the same node, the one that used to contain a manual redirect, now marked refactored. Wes leaned forward. I need to know how this was previously handled. Lena looked once at the diagram, then directly at him. It was redirected through a manual script triggered under specific conditions tied to user interaction. It was inserted outside the main branch to avoid pushing delay into the regular path. Was it documented? Number it was stabilized and left in place after resolution. Was it removed? Yes. During refactor.wes turned to the boss. Was this brought up in code review? It didn't appear in the core repo. We assumed it was legacy logic. You assumed? That word sat there for too long. Denise opened a folder. Here's the original scope adjustment HR issued to Ms. Grant when the restructure took effect. Her responsibilities were reduced. She was no longer required to review, document, or maintain legacy features. Jacob looked down. Wes looked up. So the only person who understood the logic was the one we reduced? No one answered, because they already had. Lena didn't add anything. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She was a witness in a room trying to rewind a decision it had made too quickly, for reasons that no longer made sense. Silence took over again. But this time, it wasn't from confusion. It was clarity, the kind that arrives late, after damage has already become real. The meeting ended without conclusion. Just acknowledgments, a few notes. Wes left without speaking further. The boss remained seated, still trying to reread the message as if a new meaning might appear. Lena returned to her desk. She didn't check Slack. She didn't refresh her inbox. She opened the folder where she kept every signed document tied to her role change, and added one more, the client's request, because sometimes collapse doesn't come from conflict. It comes when the last room that thought it knew how to lead goes quiet and realizes it's been following a structure that was already missing its core. By noon, 3 people had already asked the same question in 3 different ways. Do we still have the hotfix? Was that redirect script backed up anywhere? Anyone know what the fallback looked like before the refactor? The answers didn't come from Lena. They came from the silence that followed every Slack message and forwarded email chain. Jacob stayed late in the dev archive room, trying to find a backup version of the pre-refactor branch. But the team had deleted the local mirrors 2 weeks ago during the spring cleanup sprint. It was logged as non-critical asset optimization. The logic that once prevented a high-visibility crash had been labeled non-critical. That irony didn't need to be spoken aloud. Someone from DevOps tried scraping artifact caches. A senior engineer pulled down an old container image, ran the demo flow, and confirmed that the handler still worked in that snapshot, but no one could find the code behind it. It had never been merged, never reviewed, never protected. It had existed because someone quietly made sure it did. And then someone else made sure it didn't. At 3 p.m., Lena received a meeting invite, this time from legal, not engineering. The subject line was short, clarification on origin of dashboard handler. She accepted. Inside the meeting room, the general counsel was already reviewing printed logs. A compliance lead joined via video. The tone was direct but calm. We're trying to verify whether the redirect patch used during the 2022 outage was retained anywhere after the structure update. It wasn't, Lena said. The patch was written locally, never committed. It lived in the live staging instance until the rebuild. And the rebuild removed it? Yes, during a full recompile led by the new dev team. Did you provide a copy? No one requested one. There was a pause. Did you retain a copy? I kept my own version, for record keeping. That changed the tone. Legal looked up. Is it available? Lena didn't answer immediately. She reached into her folder, pulled a printed sheet, and placed it gently on the table. Not a USB, not a file transfer, paper, because that's what it had come to, relying on the personal archive of someone they'd once deemed too expensive to retain. The counsel read it, then looked at her. This was deleted from the system? She nodded. Labeled redundant. Back in engineering, the mood shifted. No one said the word mistake, but it passed through the room like a draft. The ones who had pushed for the rebuild avoided eye contact. The ones who hadn't spoken up now scrambled to claim context. The boss sent out a message requesting a retrospective on dependency mapping. It didn't mention names. It just suggested critical points of failure had been underestimated. That was the closest anyone came to saying what they already knew. They had cut something they didn't understand, because they didn't know it had been holding the weight, and now they were asking to borrow what they'd erased. Lena didn't reject them. She didn't ask for credit. She let the document speak, but she didn't send the digital version, just the printout. Because a fix that had been deleted should never be restored as if nothing happened. It should be remembered, exactly as it was lost. They didn't promote her, they didn't apologize, but they changed everything around the shape she left behind. It began with a line in a new policy draft. Any code removal that impacts client-facing flows must be reviewed by an independent maintainer familiar with live deployment history. No name attached, but everyone knew who the line pointed to. A week after the demo failure, product teams began circulating internal memos marked Legacy Dependency Mapping. The diagrams looked strangely familiar to Lena, flowcharts with no official author, but structured the way she used to sketch systems no one ever approved. Meetings were restructured. The sprint board gained a new column. Known instability, deferred fixes, and the term fallback risk became part of stand-up vocabulary, even when no one defined what it meant. The boss stopped using phrases like streamlining and reducing redundancy. Now he asked about coverage, about undocumented logic, about risk surfaces he hadn't seen before, but that were always there. Jacob kept his role, but he stopped pushing changes without asking. Not because he feared Lena, because he finally understood what she'd been doing, quietly, for years. One day, during a build review, someone hesitated over a patch note that started with temporary override. They asked, should this be flagged for external check? No one had to say who that meant. It wasn't about the person anymore. It was about what had happened when they tried to build without the weight she used to carry invisibly. Denise from legal restructured 3 compliance flows. She didn't say where the changes came from, but in the corner of one form, a box now existed that read, "Has this path previously failed outside documented flows?" That was Lena's phrasing. Wes never called her into another leadership meeting, but he began forwarding policy drafts, not with requests, but with the line, "Does this cover what wasn't seen before?" She never replied, because she didn't need to. Her responses had already been archived in the way the structure now paused at the edge of assumptions. The intern team still worked fast, still coded smart, but now they were told to leave one column in every commit summary. Who last touched this outside staging? And every time they asked that question, someone traced it back, not to a file, not to a function, but to a moment when the app hadn't broken because something unspoken had been guarding it. They didn't call it Lena's work. They didn't name her process. But they knew the difference between the system before she left and the one after it fell. And every new policy they wrote was just a mirror, one that showed them the version of the company they thought they'd outgrown, only to realize it had always been holding their reflection together. The request came quietly, no subject urgency, no CC list, just a short message from legal and a line, "Please review and return with signature if acceptable." Attached was a new clause inside the compliance framework. No production-level build shall proceed to final sign-off without review by a legacy embedded authority with recall of undocumented logic. They didn't name her, but the footnote referenced the Q2 demo. She read it once. Every task she'd handled silently, redirects, patches, fallbacks, had now been formalized into a required checkpoint, a safeguard they couldn't bypass. She didn't sign immediately. Instead, she made one edit. All sign-offs must be tied to a named reviewer with independent legal standing, insulated from restructure. It wasn't about claiming power. It was to ensure no one ever erased what held the product together just because it wasn't obvious. Wes replied an hour later, "Accepted." Routing for final approval. No apology. No offer to return. Just confirmation that her condition was now part of the system. From that point forward, she didn't receive tasks. Only files waiting for her mark. They waited. Every team. Every project. Because without her name at the bottom, nothing moved. Jacob still coded, now cautiously. He led with a checklist he called Lena's Notes, though none had ever been published. It wasn't about notes. It was about memory. The structure they'd once tried to simplify had failed when it lost the one part no one thought to protect. And now, the system had been rebuilt not around code, but around her absence. Because when something collapses without you, they no longer ask what role you used to play. They ask for your signature.